the orbit of the eye, is in fact very much a hollow in the skull. Within that hollow sits the eyeball. If you imagine that the eyeball is roughly the structure, the shape and the size of a small ping pong ball, and I'm making it reasonably larger for the demonstration, that shape, that spherical shape, sits within this hollow. So you expect that there will be a depth and a shadow thrown into that hollow. This shape, this eyeball, is held in place by intraocular muscles which fix the eyeball in place into the orbit. When the muscles on the lateral side contract, the whole eyeball turns to the lateral side, and when the medial muscles contract, the whole eyeball will turn to the medial side. However, let's take a look at the eyeball as it's looking in its more relaxed state. In this sense, the iris, which sits in the middle of the eyeball, is approximately the size slightly smaller than a 1-cent piece. In the middle of that iris, you have the pupil, which is essentially a hole. That hole can dilate or contract depending on how much light is going into the retina. So in the case of strong light, that'll be the pupil will be constricted to allow less light in. And in the case of darkened conditions, that pupil will dilate to allow more light into the eye. So depending on how the subject is sitting and how much light is coming across the subject's face, will determine how large you will make that pupil. If I'm then describing how the eye sits in the orbit, and you think about there's the eyelid, which comes across the top of the eye, and actually the upper eyelid, as in human beings, as different say to chameleons, the upper eyelid comes down across the top of the eye, and there's not much movement from the lower eye coming up. So you've got to think about how to draw the upper eyelid to reflect the movement of that eyelid on the eye, on the human eye. So here I'm just creating the shape of the eyelids, as the upper eyelid would come down and the lower eyelid would remain fairly static. And there's a slight, as I said when I was describing the portrait, making the portrait, there's a slight diagonal going down from the outside of the eye to the inside of the eye where the tear duct is, which allows the passage of tears to wash across the eye and for gravity to work on it. So the outside of the eye should always be slightly, ever so slightly, higher than the inside of the eye where the tear duct is. If you imagine this eyelid and how it sits, and you imagine the lower eyelid like this, how it'll sit, the upper eyelid bears the weight, and hence I'm giving the weight by a thickening of the eyelashes, which often are far more prominent than the lower eyelashes. The lower lid eyelashes are not so important, and the upper eyelid lashes are really designed to keep dust and foreign objects out of the eye. You have a slight shadow thrown from the upper eyelid across the eye, which can be suggested by a very, very slight shadow. And the iris has a very, very distinct line around it. So when you're drawing the eye and the iris, give it that distinct line. That by putting the pupil always in the middle of the iris, you will notice that with the upper eyelid cutting across the top of that iris, more like a 3/4 moon, naturally the pupil will sit slightly closer to the upper eyelid than it will to the lower eyelid. Therefore, you will generally see when someone's looking with an open eye, you'll be able to see the lower border of the iris, but you would not necessarily see the upper border of the iris unless they're staring at you with wide open eyes. There is also, because the curvature of this eyeball in the orbit, there's going to be a slight shadow thrown in from either side, because that would be the light coming in across a sphere. So if you keep on imagining that you're dealing with a sphere set into a hollow, there's going to be a slight shadow on the inside of that sphere on this side, because this is going to be thrown into a little bit of shadow on the inside of the eye, and there'll be a slight shadow in here, there'll be a slight shadow across where the tear duct is. So the light, if the light is a unidirectional light coming in from this side, it will be hitting that part of the eyelid that is protruding out of the orbit. It'll also be hitting this part of the white of the eye, and it'll be throwing a strong highlight on the outside, say, of the iris, this being the lateral side. So then you have to think about what will the color be, or what will be the tone. Diagonally opposite the highlight on the eye will be the lightest part of the iris. The rest of the iris will be very, very dark in color. Even if the person has light-toned eyes, you'll have the darkest darks in the pupil and largely around the area around the highlight, and then diagonally opposite the highlight will be the lightest part of that iris. This gives it a glassiness when you're drawing it tonally like this. The upper lashes are going to be strong. As I said before, the lower lashes are going to be softer. You can describe the underside of the eye like that. And most people have a slight softening of the underside of the eye as the eyelid actually comes down and on the underside comes up around the eye. So that's essentially what the eye would be looking at. So you can see that it starts off that you have to imagine that there's a ball, a sphere that sits within a socket, that eyeball has got to fit in with that frame. If you just draw a really large iris, which is often the habit of people who aren't really familiar with the anatomy of the eye, there's a general tendency to make the iris quite big. Well, then if you think about the white of the eye, the ball of the eye, the actual eyeball, would not otherwise fit in that orbit. So pay particular attention when you're drawing the eye to draw it considering the eyeball, not just the iris. And one thing that might help a lot of people, and I've seen this by suggesting that they try and draw the white of the eye rather than the iris, because by looking at the white of the eye, you're in fact really dealing with, in a way, the negative shape around the iris, and that actually helps you figure out the proportions of the iris. You can also take into account then, you've got the glabella, so you've got the eyebrow, and that gives you a good framework for what the eye is about.